Hi, everybody, both here and at home or wherever they are on Zoom. Welcome to today's presentation. I'm Dan Slater. I'm the director of WCED, the Weiser Center for Emerging Democracies. And we are delighted today to be playing host to Charles McClean. Briefly introduce Charles. He's the Toyota visiting professor at the Center for Japanese Studies here at the University of Michigan. Charles studies comparative politics in advanced democracies with a focus on political institutions, representation, social welfare, local politics, and Japan. Prior to coming to Michigan, Charles earned his PhD in political science from UC San Diego in 2020, and he was a postdoctoral fellow in the program on U.S.-Japan relations at Harvard University in 2020 and 2021, although I imagine you probably didn't get to be at Harvard very much during that particular year. A couple of words on just the theme and why I'm really excited about having Charles specifically here and speaking about both the topic of youth and the specific case of Japan. Although we are a center on emerging democracies, as I've always said since coming here about 4 years ago, the only way to understand emerging democracies is to understand their many opposites, and that includes democracies that are very established. And I think Japan, among all the established democracies in the world, probably gets the least attention in comparative politics, despite the many lessons it has to offer. And I think as we see democracies eroding, backsliding, et cetera, around so much of the world, including in the supposedly superior democratic West, it behooves us to be thinking a lot about these democracies in the so-called East that don't seem to be having a lot of the same problems. So I think having a talk on Japan is really great. I'm also, really excited to be talking about the topic of youth within our annual theme. As you might know, our annual theme is capitalism and democracy. And I think when we think about the problems of inequality around the world and the rising questions of incompatibility, possibly, between what capitalism is today and democracy is today, I think one of the most important lenses for thinking about that is that of generations and intergenerational inequality. And the question of whether or not capitalism as it currently exists in the world is actually able to deal with inequalities and lack of opportunity among youth. Those certainly lesser, life chances, opportunities than earlier generations. So I don't expect Charles to tackle all of that in his talk, but these are things we're thinking about over the course of the year here at WCED. And I think what Charles will be presenting today is going to be a really interesting part of that puzzle. Really fascinating topic, which will be silver democracy, youth representation in aging Japan. So Charles, thanks very much. There is a crowd at home as well, so look forward to hearing from you.
Great, thanks so much, Dan. Very happy to be here. Okay. So in most countries, politicians are often much older than the average constituent. So we could think about last year's presidential election in the United States, where the two major party candidates, Joe Biden and Donald Trump, were both in their 70s and represented the oldest candidates in US history, with Biden then going on to become the oldest president. Japan, the focus of today's talk, also had a leadership transition this year, when the oldest prime minister in about 30 years, Yoshihide Suga, resigned and was succeeded by the younger, but still in his mid-60s, Fumio Kishida, who just led the LDP in Japan to a victory in last Sunday's election. So for many of us here in the US, in Japan, and other places, this type of gerontocracy, where politicians tend to be much older, seems very natural, not just at the top executive positions, but really across all levels of government. And while it is true that young people tend to be underrepresented in most political institutions, there's actually quite a bit of variation across advanced democracies. So here I am showing the percentage of members of parliament of the lower or unicameral house, MPs, who are under 40 years old in 30 advanced democracies. What we can see is that the US and Japan rank second and third to last, with just 6 to 7% of members under 40. One potentially problematic thing with these relationships is that there's actually no relationship among advanced democracies between the age demographics of voters and the age demographics of politicians. If we look at the two ends of the spectrum, South Korea actually has a younger voting age population than Denmark, even though it has 20 times fewer MPs under 40. And so in my book project and work, I often think about, is this something we should be concerned about? There's all sorts of issues that disproportionately affect the young, such as those that have to do with unemployment, education, and childcare. young people will also be disproportionately affected by longer-term issues like climate change and social welfare reform. And so there's at least a worry that if decisions are only made by mostly older politicians, it could be detrimental to both the shorter and long-term interests of younger generations. And if we look at just sort of cross-national correlations, there's at least some suggestive evidence that there may be some relationships. So here I've now put MPs under 40 on the x-axis, and the y-axis is the percent of GDP spent on family policy. And it does seem to be a relationship where the US and Japan have very few MPs under 40, and they also spend much less on family policy, much less on child welfare than other advanced democracies, both in absolute terms, as I show here, and if I were to show you relative to how much they spend on the elderly. So in my broader book project, I'm very interested in two questions. So the first is sort of why are young people underrepresented in some institutions, some electoral settings, and not elsewhere? But today, given the theme, I'm going to focus much more on the second question, which is, does it matter? Should we be concerned? Does the underrepresentation of young people in public office matter for social policy? Here, I think both in terms of whether it matters for the extent to which their interests get even included in the policymaking process. But today, I'm going to focus especially on whether it matters for policy outcomes, for social spending, for how governments allocate welfare between age groups and also over time. And that's going to be my main argument. The main point I'm going to focus on today is that I'm going to show evidence and argue that a politician's age can affect the types of welfare policies they promote, and more specifically, the extent to which they allocate welfare resources both between age groups and over time. I'm going to introduce original data that I've collected on Japanese local elections, and we're going to focus today especially on mayoral elections. Mayoral elections because Japanese mayors have sort of real authority over welfare budgets and over welfare spending. I'm going to use something called a regression discontinuity design, and I'm also going to talk about interviews that I did with 15 Japanese mayors, as well as a bunch of municipal bureaucrats who work in social welfare departments. And just to give you a sense of where I'm going just for today, I'm going to find that basically younger mayors really increase their municipality spending on child welfare, especially through long-term investments in infrastructure. I actually find that they about double the municipality's prior level in sort of investing in building daycare centers, expanding daycare centers, constructing new ones. By comparison, I don't find that older mayors spend more on elderly welfare. Basically, municipalities everywhere, they're really responsive to how many older voters there are, not whether the mayor themselves is older. But I do find that older mayors shift the time direction of the spending away from long-term investment and more toward the short term. I'm going to talk a lot more about this, but hopefully today I'm going to provide some insights that these can contribute to our understanding of representation, and specifically as Dan was talking about the role of youth underrepresentation in advanced democracies, intergenerational inequality, and then also some insights for Japanese politics. So within work on elite behavior or representation, we really don't have a lot that thinks about age and elite behavior, how age affects the behavior of elites or how age affects representation. And particularly, we don't have much work on young people. Does youth underrepresentation matter? Do young people behave differently than older people in office? This, at the beginning of the project, was surprising to me because we just have such a wide array, such a wealth of literature on how a variety of other characteristics affect the behavior of politicians in office. Gender, race, ethnicity, class, sexual orientation, all of these matter for the extent to which ideas get incorporated into the policymaking process. While we don't have work on age and elites, we also have a lot of great studies about how age affects the public's attitudes and behavior. So in translating, sort of building from these two literatures and thinking about how age affects elites, the first point that I focus on is that I'm expecting that younger politicians are going to be more likely to promote welfare benefits for younger families than older politicians who are going to focus more on the elderly. So a lot of times in my work, what I think about is sort of the ways in which age is kind of similar to other types of characteristics and identities and the ways in which it's different. And one way in which I think it can be similar is that I expect the descriptive representation, or the relative presence of young people in public office, to matter for the substantive representation, the degree to which their interests get incorporated into policies. Age, like gender or race, is an ascriptive characteristic, and we know that it affects all sorts of public attitudes. And so there's many different potential mechanisms about how descriptive representation can lead to substantive representation. I'm going to focus just on two. So one is sort of focuses more on the intrinsic side, which is that we know that age affects the public's attitudes. And on social spending, for example, young people tend to prefer greater spending, say, on childcare and education. Older people prefer greater public spending on pensions and healthcare. And so here, one sort of more intrinsic motivation is the idea that when young people get to office, they're going to bring these preferences with them and act on them even if they think it might cost them votes. They're going to act in sort of their sincere preferences. An alternative possibility could be that they really have electoral incentives. So we could think that maybe younger representatives, for example, are going to think that younger voters are like, they have a comparative advantage in targeting this group, right? They're going to get a relative advantage for focusing more on youth issues, and so it has more to do with sort of extrinsic motivations about winning an election. Because of the time today, and because I want to focus on other parts of the book as well, I'm not going to focus as much on the mechanisms. I'm going to focus more on the overall effects, but I'm happy to talk more about these differences between sort of preferences and incentives. But my first expectations is just that, so my first hypothesis is that I think younger politicians are going to promote welfare benefits more for younger families than older politicians. And conversely, older politicians I expect to be relatively more likely to promote welfare benefits for the elderly. This doesn't mean that I think that younger politicians aren't going to do anything for the elderly, or that the older politicians aren't going to do anything for the young. I'm talking very much in relative terms to the degree to which they focus on these policies. Now, in thinking about ways in which age is similar to other identities, but also in ways in which it's different, I'm going to focus especially on time horizons and on the relationship between age and time. And so I think that younger politicians are also going to be more likely to promote long-term investment in social welfare, whereas I expect older politicians will focus relatively more on sort of short-term spending. So the idea here is sort of resting on this argument that younger politicians have longer time horizons, both as younger people with longer remaining lifespans, and potentially as younger professionals, younger politicians with longer remaining careers. This means that they have a longer period over which they might expect to benefit, whether personally or professionally, from longer-term social gains. So the idea is that they may discount the future less and care about it more. And we tend to think that long-term investment has this sort of trade-off where it comes with some kind of short-term cost. So I think that maybe younger politicians are going to be more willing to make this trade-off. They might be more willing to impose costs on their constituents in the short term, such as by raising taxes, for the possibility of a greater welfare payoff in the long run, such as via investment. So said differently, my expectations for this part is that I think that younger politicians are going to relatively promote more long-term policies, more long-term investment in welfare, compared to older politicians who I expect will focus relatively more on short-term spending. Again, speaking in relative, not absolute. So my book project is especially focused on Japan, which, as Dan was saying, I think it's an excellent case, excellent place to study these issues for a couple of reasons. So one is that age-related social policy, age-related social welfare, is very salient in the world's oldest country. So here I'm showing some demographic trends in Japan. I'm just going to explain that on the x-axis here, these are years. It's showing from 1950 to 2020, and then projections out to 2050. On the y-axis is the population in millions. So at the bottom here, in this sort of light pink color, this is the number of children under 15. The tan is people between the ages of 15 and 64, and the bright red at the top is those people who are 65 and older. And so there's sort of three parts to the demographic crisis or demographic challenge for Japan. The huge increase in the number of elderly over time, at the same time that children, and then via children, workers are declining. So those two trends, followed with a third one, which is that you can see that the overall height of the bar is also very recently starting to decline as Japan's population shrinks. So this is going to cause all sorts of issues for Japan in the years ahead. Over the next 20 years, the government expects that social welfare costs, which are already the largest part of the budget, are going to increase by 60%, at the same time that the number of workers to fund those programs are going to decline by 20%. And so in this kind of setting, the decision that politicians make over welfare policies matters for all sorts of reasons. It matters at the individual level because it affects individual decisions about family planning, savings, investment, and retirement. But it also matters in the bigger picture in terms of the long-term sort of fiscal sustainability of Japan, long-term economic growth, and labor shortages. The other reason that I think Japan's a good case is that although Japan is the world's oldest country, this is the direction in which most advanced democracies are going. So behind Japan is South Korea, behind Japan is Germany, behind Japan is Italy, and a little ways behind is us here in the United States. So other countries are trending in this direction, and Japan can kind of give us some sort of window into what might lie ahead for other advanced democracies. I mentioned earlier that I'm going to focus especially on local politics and how they have sort of dealt with issues related to aging populations. And one thing that I sort of focus on is that Japan has 1,741 municipalities, and there's actually a lot of variation in the level of care and protection they provide their citizens across these municipalities. So the national government does establish a sort of minimum level of welfare services that all municipalities have to provide. But after that, there's a lot of variation in terms of some municipalities provide much more generous benefits for the elderly, some more meager, and likewise for younger families. And so as just one example, we could think about sort of the variation in childcare availability in Japan, which has become a major issue. And so given the last slide, it might seem odd that childcare availability is a problem given the decline in children. But because of women entering the workforce at much, much higher rates, Japan has sort of struggled to keep up with the demand for publicly provided childcare. Also in Japan, unlike in the United States, the government really takes a central role in providing daycare, and especially municipalities play the central role. And so there's some municipalities where there are really long wait lists to get into public daycare and others where there are none. Recently, some estimates suggest that as many as 600,000 to 850,000 children have been unable to find spots. And so it's a major policy issue. And again, it's an issue where younger voters, younger parents in particular, feel like mostly older politicians are not really paying attention to their interests, not paying attention to how much they want childcare. So this is one example. It's a childcare protest among younger parents. They're holding up signs. The most common sign says, "Hoiken ochita no watashi da," which is like, I am one of the people who failed to get a daycare spot. This was sort of in response to the idea that politicians were not paying much attention to their interests. Finally, I'm going to focus on mayors, because mayors have real discretion over welfare spending. And I want to focus especially on social spending. I said earlier about predictions about promoting welfare policies, but I'm going to focus, at least in this part of the book, about does it matter for actual spending outcomes. And the reason why mayors are a great place to focus on, well, so in Japan, they do have about 55% to 60% of expenditures on social welfare are decided at the local level. Mayors have this exclusive right to draft the annual budget, and they have all sorts of powers over assemblies to implement their preferred policies. But from a research design standpoint as well, focusing on executives makes it kind of easier for me to connect age to their policy decisions. Because in Japan, local elections are mostly nonpartisan. So about 98% of mayors run as independents. There's less party influence. And the mayor is an executive. So I can look at sort of how a younger mayor choose what budgets they choose or versus older mayors. Whereas in a legislature, politicians have to work with other legislators, the party, often the executive to pass legislation. And younger legislators, if they are in the parliament, they tend to be backbenchers, so they don't really have the same level of policy influence. So the problem with studying this in Japan, like many places, is that it's really difficult to get detailed data on local politics. It's already difficult in many countries to get sort of national level election results, but getting detailed municipal level candidates who ran for municipal assembly, who ran for mayor is very difficult. So we're kind of missing this part. And one of the bigger parts of my book project and broader work has been to try and build a large data set to fill in this gap. The first part of building this data set has focused on web scraping. So basically, I web scrape two types of sites. Portal sites where users can kind of go on and fill out the information about their local municipality, and newspapers. This is one example. So here I showed an example. This is this guy here, Shuhei Azuma. He was the youngest mayor in Japan. I think it says something that even the youngest mayor in Japan is going gray. But he became mayor at age 28. And so I'm showing you his election at age 28 when he defeated a 61-year-old incumbent. So this is an example of a portal site. It's called election.com or senkyo.com. And I'm showing you sort of the type of information that's here. I realize it's written in Japanese. But basically, I scrape thousands and thousands of sites like this. And then I use newspapers to try and fill in the gaps, correct errors that people make when they're entering information about their local elections. So after years of doing this, I'm excited that my data set right now has almost every candidate who ran for either mayor or municipal assembly in Japan over a 20-year period. So almost 200,000 candidates running for either municipal assembly or mayor in 18,000 elections. But today, I'm really focusing on these mayor data. So I'm only going to look at a small portion of it. I'm going to talk about 12,000 mayoral candidates who ran for election between 2006 and 2019. Happy to talk more during discussion about why I focus on these years, but basically in Japan in the early 2000s, a bunch of municipalities merged together, and the government also instituted rules that changed how municipalities fund their social welfare programs. So it's very difficult looking at the early 2000s to kind of connect mayors to outcomes. So here's just a look at the data. I'm happy to talk more about other aspects of the data. So one thing that it can show us, for example, is that unfortunately Japanese candidates not always very diverse. 98% of mayors in Japan are men. Well over 99% are ethnically Japanese. And then about 90% are over the age of 50. So the average here, this figure here is showing the age at the time of election. The dark gray is mayors, and the light gray is the voting age population. And the y-axis is basically a relative density plot. And so Japan is an older country. We can see that the population's pretty well distributed over various age groups, whereas mayors kind of like shoot up. It reminds me of like a volcano or something like that. It's really single peaked, very peaked at the average age which a mayor starts office, which is 62. So in Japan, this crucial office that has all sorts of decisions over welfare policies has traditionally been the office that people have right before retirement. It is the type of job that you have, that you enter at sort of your late 50s, and you hold it for like 2 terms or so on average, and then you retire. Only 10% of candidates are under 50 years old. Only 2% of candidates are under 40. So really, it's a very older job. I'm going to compare this data on mayors with sort of great data that the Japanese government already has on municipal expenditures. So while they don't have the best data on elections, Japan does a wonderful job, the municipalities do a wonderful job of really carefully tracking how they spend their money. And what's great for my purposes is I can focus on both spending that went toward children, child welfare. These are spending on like parental leave benefits, daycare centers, subsidies for having children, and spending focused toward the elderly. The national government in Japan takes care of pensions, but it's up to the local government to otherwise focus on nursing services, elderly centers. So I'm going to compare these 2 types of spending. I can also code spending and sort of focus more on the short term versus the long term. Happy to talk more about how I did this again during the discussion. But in general, I talk about short-term spending as direct social payments to constituents or funds used to sort of reduce the cost of services, with the idea being that this is sort of a quick social gain that mayors can deliver. And long-term investment in the case of child welfare and elderly welfare is almost entirely infrastructure. It's building or expanding existing sort of centers that deal with elderly or the young. And then happy to talk more about this too, but for the dependent variable, what I'm going to be focusing on is changes in spending rather than levels. I'm going to use a log of the spending just to prevent outliers from affecting the results. But basically, I'm going to interpret the results. When you do a difference in logs, it's sort of like a percentage change. So I'm going to be looking at sort of the percentage change in expenditures due to electing a younger or older mayor. The other part that I'm happy to talk more during the discussion is that I'm going to use a common design in political science called a regression discontinuity design, or especially a close election RDD. And I'm just going to talk about the intuition here. But the basic intuition is that you can't just compare spending in municipalities that elect younger and older mayors, because those municipalities are going to differ in all sorts of other ways. They're going to have different socio-demographic characteristics. They're going to have different levels of pre-existing welfare. And those differences could affect both their preferences for mayors and their preferences for welfare policies. So the idea of this close election RDD is I'm going to look at really close races, municipalities that had really close elections between younger and older candidates. And I'm going to compare the municipality where the younger candidate just barely won to the cases where the older candidate just barely won. And the idea, and I can show this, show you some data to back this up if you'd like, these municipalities are very similar in all sorts of ways. They have similar levels of youth, similar levels of elderly, similar levels of spending, and they're only differing in whether that younger mayor or older mayor gets elected. Again, I'm happy to talk about, I'm sort of the first one to try and adapt this design for using age. It's been used a lot to compare male versus female candidates, Democrats versus Republicans, ethnic group A versus ethnic group B. But age is a little bit trickier because it's hard to know exactly how to deal with the cutoffs. What I do is I try to balance both what age seems to matter for the type of welfare policy and just this particular institutional and cultural context. So I'm actually using 50 as the cutoff for a younger mayor because this is sort of the youngest 10%. And people in their 20s, 30s, and 40s tend to be the types of people who have younger children who benefit from child welfare. And I'm also going to actually look at elderly mayors as well, which is mayors 70 and over. These are the oldest 10% of mayors. And I'm going to compare them to basically the typical mayor, who's between 50 and 69. Okay, very last bit before we get to the results is that I also did months of fieldwork in Japan, interviewing mayors and municipal bureaucrats. I visited 20 municipalities between October 2018 and July 2019 by myself and did interviews in Japanese, with interviews lasting about an average of 45 minutes. These interviews were very helpful for, I'm focusing in this sort of chapter more about sort of overall effects, but the interviews were very helpful for sort of teasing out mechanisms. And they were also very helpful because I could actually go to the municipal bureaucrats sort of with my code and look over the budgets together and make sure that I was getting it right, make sure that I was understanding that I was tracking their spending and that I was doing, measuring it the way that they intended. Okay, so let's look at the results. So does the age of a mayor affect how they redistribute welfare between age groups, how they spend money on younger families, how they spend money on the elderly? So I'm going to show these types of figures. The punchline that I find is that younger mayors increase spending on child welfare by 36% relative to older mayors, sorry. This is discretionary spending. I should have said earlier, I'm focusing on the type of spending that younger mayors can really control. It doesn't include spending set by the central government according to sort of demographic formulas. So this is like the part of the budget that the mayor can control. They increase it by 36%. Now, since I'm going to show a bunch of these figures, I'm going to explain this one a bit slower, and then hopefully you'll, if you're not familiar with it, it'll become clear. So let's look at the left side. This is measuring what is the effect of a younger mayor on changes in spending on child welfare. The x-axis here is the candidate under 50's vote margin. And so what's changing at this zero axis right here is on the right side of the axis, the vote margin's positive, the younger candidate won. On the left side of the zero, that younger candidate just barely lost and the older candidate won. And the y-axis is how did the change in, what was the change from the year before the election to the year after the election in that municipality's discretionary spending on child welfare. And so if we look right here, we can see that those municipalities very similar, where the older mayor just barely won, they tended to slightly decrease their spending on child welfare. Whereas the ones just to the right-hand side, we see a discontinuity, a jump. Just to the right where that younger mayor barely won, they increase it by a significant amount. And so this 36% that I have here is coming from the gap between modeling these two lines. Here, these lines are sort of modeling the trends, and these circles are sort of bins of the raw data. Happy again to talk more about it. On the other hand, I find that while younger mayors increase spending on child welfare, they don't take money away from the elderly. They don't increase spending on elderly. Here we see no jump. Those municipalities are spending the same amounts on elderly. Younger mayors are just increasing the spending on child welfare. So if we look at the effect of older mayors, I find that they don't change either side of the budget. So mayors who are 70 and over, so the only thing that's changed between this one and this one is I'm looking at those close races where it was a candidate 70 and over defeating a younger candidate. And here, the candidates 70 and over, they make no changes to spending on child welfare. They make no changes to spending on elderly welfare. So why might this be the case? Why does it seem that age seems to matter for younger mayors and not for older mayors? So like I was talking about earlier, I do find some who talk about sort of how their personal experiences with welfare or how the experiences of their friends among younger mayors influence their thinking on sort of child welfare. So this younger mayor that I spoke with said, I feel my age gives me insights into the challenges faced by younger parents. I myself had difficulty finding a daycare spot for my child, as did many of my friends. So why don't we see differences on elderly welfare? Well, I was kind of surprised when I did the interviews. I thought that maybe I asked many of the mayors and municipal bureaucrats if they thought that the government tended to focus more on the interests of younger people or more on the focuses of older people. And in political science, sometimes we talk about sort of social desirability bias, where we think that the government's not going to really answer because they don't want to, they're concerned about how it might sound. That did not apply in this case. Everyone told me that the government focuses more on what the elderly wants. Every mayor was quite open about how the elderly are much better organized, turn out to vote at much higher rates. They're the people who participate in their campaigns, participate in their groups. And so everyone was quite open about it. In fact, one younger mayor I spoke with said that recently I asked an old group of older people if they would be willing to accept less support to help fund a new daycare center. However, I received such strong opposition that I decided to find money in other areas of the budget instead. So I'm not going to show you some more like quantitative results to back this up, but in other parts of the book project, I look and find that there's a clear relationship between the number of elderly voters or how organized elderly voters are and changes in elderly welfare spending. But there's no relationship between how many younger parents there are, how many young people there are, and changes in spending toward children. So what I sort of found and what I try to argue is that it seems for young people what really matters is this descriptive representation. When you have a younger mayor, the municipality changes spending on child welfare, but there's no other like relationship between the demographics. But the elderly don't seem to need descriptive representation, even though they're also underrepresented in office to a small degree. They seem to get their representation, at least to my findings, more through turning out in elections. So let's talk about the other part. Does age affect how a mayor allocates spending over time? So first, looking at how younger mayors are allocating their spending on child welfare. So here I find that most of that 36% increase is coming from younger mayors doubling their prior investment in child welfare. So here on the this is going back to candidates under 50. What's the effect of narrowly electing a younger mayor? And we see kind of opposite effects. So it's worth noting that the y-axis is a slightly different scale here. But I find that younger mayors actually decrease short-term spending on children by a little bit, by about 20%, to about 100% increase the amount spent on investment. This is not only like a big effect, it's also substantively meaningful. So I should have said earlier that the overall effect on spending on child welfare in US dollars is about $200 per child, or about $3.5 million in total. And about 80% of that increase is coming from them sort of doubling the investment budget. And this doubling in investment is meaning that younger mayors are sort of more likely to address these sort of daycare waiting list issues by either expanding or sort of constructing new daycare centers. Lastly, I do find sort of opposite effects for older mayors. So older mayors, although they don't increase the overall spending on elderly welfare, they decrease investment and shift it toward the short term. So they're less likely to spend on sort of infrastructure and spending. They're more likely to directly give it out as social payments to constituents. So there is no overall change, just a change in sort of the temporal dimension. So what I found was that while the effect on sort of between groups is more asymmetric, with younger mayors having an effect and older mayors not having an effect, the effects for time seem to be a bit more symmetric between the two. And I found that in the interviews as well, when I talked to mayors and I asked sort of how do you feel your age affects how you approach welfare policies, they didn't like thinking about it in terms of sort of the intergenerational trade-off. They were hesitant to talk about sort of decreasing funding for the elderly to fund children, decreasing funding for children to fund the elderly. They often answered in sort of intertemporal or about time. So for example, younger mayors, this is just sort of stark contrast in what they said, but this is one younger mayor. My goal is not only to think about the next 4 years, but to think about implementing policies that are sustainable for the next 20 to 30 years. So the buzzword, I had multiple mayors tell me that like sustainable was one of the key words that they tried to emphasize in their campaigns. Conversely, when I spoke to older mayors, they often talked about how they felt their experience in office gave them all sorts of tools to deal with the sort of short-term needs that were facing the elderly in their district. So this mayor, for example, an older mayor I spoke with said, mayors have a certain role to play in Japanese politics. I'm not going to be mayor forever. As such, I feel I can have the greatest impact by focusing on the immediate needs of my constituents. So again, when I asked mayors sort of, what do you think about this sort of, aging population, declining birth rates, where do you think the focus should be? There's just differences. Everyone agreed that it's a huge crisis for Japan, just differences in what they tended to focus on first, with young people very concerned about the declining population and the future of what that declining birth rate might be, and older politicians just relatively more likely to talk about, hey, we have sort of elderly poverty going on right now. We have all sorts of, we can't take money away from the elderly. They need greater support. So what I've tried to show today is just a part of this larger book project, but a part arguing that there's sort of that the age of elected officials matters for substantive representation, and it matters for policy outcomes. It matters for how governments spend money on social policy. So I found that younger mayors increase spending on child welfare, especially through long-term investments in infrastructure. Older mayors did not increase spending on elderly welfare. Nobody touches the total amount spent on elderly welfare. They just shifted some more to the short term. I think these kinds of findings can have all sorts of insights for how we understand representation and elite behavior, both to sort of contribute age to the broader conversations about representation, but again, thinking about ways in which it's similar and different to other identities. So I thought it was similar in how it affected sort of decisions about young people to be substantive representation, like to pursue substantive representation, to pursue interests, desired by their similarly underrepresented group, but different in some ways because it not only affected how politicians allocated welfare between groups, but also over time. I think it also said something about sort of social welfare and inequality, and something about whether or not we should be concerned about intergenerational conflict, that's often said. So on the one hand, some people, when they've seen my presentation, they see it as sort of good news, because young people like increase spending on the young, but they don't take money away from the old. And that could be interesting, but another view is that they kind of might prefer to take money away, but the elderly just have such strong power in elections that they're sort of unable to. And so the downside is thinking about, can young people really get attention to their interests in the vast majority of cases in Japan, which is where they don't have descriptive representation. And then lastly, just thinking about Japanese politics and thinking about what this may mean for sort of that I think that policies that have been discussed about possibly addressing gerontocracy, possibly encouraging more young people to run for office, encouraging young people to run national government and local government, may also have consequences for how those governments deal with these sort of pressing social challenges. So in the book, this is actually sort of the end of a long process where I sort of, in the second half of the book, where I trace that basically voters expect younger and older candidates to behave differently in office. Younger and older candidates behave differently on the campaign trail. They say that they're going to emphasize different things. And this is kind of the end of that train, showing that it matters, it affects how they actually spend money in these municipalities. Also, I'm not going to show it here, but this was just focusing on mayors because it kind of gave this window into a case where they had real decisions over social spending. But in other parts of the book, I show that age also affects how national politicians behave, how they answer surveys, the types of language that they use in their campaigns. So happy to talk about those results as well. I didn't want to end without just at least giving you a brief window into the other question, which is why are young people underrepresented in some countries and not others? And what I find really matters, or so it seems to matter, is especially political institutions. So this is a cross-national look at data that I've collected from 68 of the 68 largest democracies. And it's basically showing what type of electoral system do they have. And so I find that younger representatives are much more common in countries that have proportional representation than countries with majoritarian electoral systems. I also show in the book how Japan changing its electoral system led to more young people running for office, and I look at variation across municipalities. But what seems to really matter in terms of whether young people run, at least in part, we could also talk about ambition, but at least at the institutional side, what seems to matter is the extent to which the electoral system or other institutions require candidates to accumulate significant financial resources, name recognition, local ties. These are the types of resources that people tend to accrue with age. It's very difficult to accrue them at a young age. So systems that emphasize that, very few young representatives, compared to systems where parties play a much more central role. They present voters with sort of a slate of candidates. And just like it's been found for sort of ethnic and racial minorities and for women, these parties also have incentives to make sure that they don't only have older candidates on the ballot. Interestingly, at least in Japan, what doesn't seem to matter is voter biases. So I have other work that kind of, it's fun, we play with sort of using age manipulation software, like age progression and regression software, changing the faces of candidates. I've also tried it with text and using the faces of real candidates. This is a hypothetical candidate. But when we present voters with sort of faces or descriptions of candidates, what comes through in Japan is actually everybody really likes younger candidates, including elderly voters. Sometimes elderly voters are one of the most supportive group toward having younger candidates. And I wonder if this might be the case in part because they kind of know that younger candidates aren't going to take away their benefits. They feel comfortable and they're okay with this sort of trade-off. They know that it's not going to come away. So again, happy to talk about other parts of the project. Thanks so much for listening and look forward to the discussion.
So we just a minute, we need to get the microphones going here. So we have a few questions that are already coming in on Zoom. So hi, those on Zoom. I see there's some questions coming in on Zoom. And so everyone in the audience here hopefully also ask questions as well. I just wanted to start with a couple of questions, Charles, if I could. So first of all, I really appreciate the talk. It was a model of clarity. I especially appreciated your cutoff point of 50. I'm 49, so the fact that I still qualify as younger rather than middle-aged for at least another couple months, I think just shows what great research it is.
Yeah, the joke I often make is that as I get older, I'm pushing the
keep
cutoff
pushing
back
the
further.
right. Exactly. So first question I had was about term limits,
Sure.
because I think term limits is the issue where voters love them and political scientists hate them. And I'm just curious what I imagine at UCSD, lots of people talk about them and hate them. So I'd be curious if this gives you any different perspective. Does this give you any more sympathy toward term limits than the average political scientist who tends to think of them as really quite disastrous? And then the second question I had was about, so you didn't show like your controls and other things. So I'm sure something that you controlled for, but I'd be curious what the results were about like the age profile of the constituency. Because of course one possibility is, the youth get more when there are more young voters rather than a young mayor. And I'm sort of hoping there's at least some result, because if there's not any result, one would think that at some level it's kind of worrisome for democracy in the sense that it's all about who the leader is and it really doesn't matter what your voters look like. So I'm just curious, you don't just have to show the results, but what did you find is that an alternative explanation that the youth get more where they're more young voters?
Yeah, thank you so much for both those questions. So first, on the part of term limits, no, I'm not more positive toward them, toward others. So the one thing I would say is, I didn't mention this in the talk, but I do think about sort of, lots of political scientists focused on how term limits and other types of institutions can affect a politician's time horizons. And so I've looked at it in that literature in kind of a different way, and thinking, in my work, I'm thinking that age can kind of function as a biological determinant of time horizons compared to the more institutional. So I do look at a lot of that literature, but I have not looked at it extensively. But to the extent I've looked at, it doesn't seem like term limits increase the number of young people who run. They may decrease the number of elderly who run, but just instituting term limits doesn't kind of help with, doesn't help with some of the sort of institutional parts. So I've looked before at sort of states that sort of, in the US that implemented term limits, and you don't really see more people in sort of their 40s or 30s. People are still entering at about the same age. They're just getting kicked out earlier. So to me, it feels like you're getting all the negative aspects that come with the expertise parts that people usually focus on, plus you're not really getting, at least from the youth perspective, the benefit of having younger people in office. The second part, I feel kind of bad that I'm afraid it's going to suggest what you were worried. I don't know if I can do the mouse. Sorry. So this is looking at what you were asking about, which is I was comparing sort of in these close election municipalities, is it more about the mayor or is it more about the voters? And so on the left-hand side, this is looking at the change in spending on child welfare, and it's comparing the mayor. This is just a coefficient plot of the RDD. So the mayor is doing that 36% increase, but at least I haven't found any connection between voters under 50 or number of children, estimates of number of parents. I haven't found a clear connection. This is changes in spending on child welfare and changes in spending in discretionary. There's certainly a relationship between the sort of mandatory government spending based on formulas that happens automatic. So on the child welfare side, I haven't really found the voter connection. But on the elderly welfare side, it's the opposite, where I haven't found any effect of having a mayor 70 and over or other age cutoffs, 65 and over, 60 and over, no effect on changing spending. But the more older voters there are, the more likely the municipality is to increase spending on elderly welfare.
Wow, that's wild. So I know we have a few questions here in the audience. So there'll be a mic coming around, and we'll get to the Zoom questions in a minute.
I go first. Oh, thank you for the presentation. I have a few related questions. One, you said the younger mayors do not cut elderly welfare. Where do they make up for the deficiency? Do they have any pressure of balancing the budget, or they can just increase it? Two, does it affect their chance of getting reelected? Three, and does that change the map, domestic map of constituency? Do people migrate because, you see, for example, if you see a younger mayor reelected and succeeded by another younger mayor who keep spending more on child welfare, does that increase domestic migration of younger people into the locality? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. All great questions. Okay, so on the first one, the first question was, how do they fund it? right? So it's interesting, the way that they mostly fund it is through municipal bonds. So they partly fund the increase in investment by decreasing that short-term spending, but most of it is through issuing municipal bonds. And so it's interesting to me, again, from the perspective of intergenerational conflict, because bonds are kind of, they're asking sort of future generations more to pay for it. So they're not only sort of, again, avoiding taking money from the elderly in the short term, but they're kind of putting the costs of those daycare centers on the young themselves, too. So this is the answer to just your general question. I'm sorry, I forgot the second one. The third one was about migration. So what was the second one? Election, oh yeah. I haven't found a clear connection. It's a little bit tricky. I'm a little bit limited because I am focusing on sort of after this last round of municipal mergers in Japan. So I don't have that many cases, like I have a short time span. I don't have that many mayors running, but I haven't found a clear connection that say the younger mayors who do invest clearly get more votes. But I'm not sure that I have enough data to clearly look at that. And your third question about migration, I also haven't looked at, or haven't been able to show with data that happens, but I can say from interviews that they definitely think it's going to happen, or it's part of the calculus. So one idea that they have is that investing in childcare is going to sort of cater to younger constituents, and they're bringing sort of these preferences into office. But I also hear them talk a lot about how if there's kind of a desire to be known as a municipality that is a great place to raise children. Because we talked about sort of the declining population as a country as a whole, but it's really differentially affecting different municipalities in Japan. And some municipalities, and quite a few of them, are actually at sort of risk of extinction. They have basically no young people. And so it's also a calculus for the mayor that's sort of, focusing, becoming known as a great, sumiyasu, great place to live, great place to raise children, is a way to try and stave off population decline, bring in more people, increase sort of general tax revenue. So that's all great questions. I hope I answered them.
Hey, so thank you. This was actually really impressive talk. So my first question is kind of a two-finger on Dan's question about the term limit, and I want to push a little bit more about that. So in Japan, generally, local politicians serve very, very long term, right? So this is not a mayorship, but on Sunday, the governor of Miyagi Prefecture was re-elected. And this is his fifth term. He is now 61, but when he was first elected, he was 45. So in your criteria, he was young when he was first elected, and now he's old as the fifth term governor. And so I'm curious about sort of whether a vacancy is necessary for young mayors to be elected, and if that's the case, would you probably more pro-term limit? That's my first question, and I guess this is related to some I think mechanism. If you can discuss a little more about that, but because it's I think related to whether this is about the time horizon or descriptive representation.
Yeah.
Well, I think you can answer this question first.
Yeah. Okay, thank you so much, Yuki. Yeah, so one thing I've looked at is whether younger mayors are sort of more likely to run for re-election, and they are more likely to run for re-election, but we don't really see what's called sort of progressive ambition as much in Japan for the reasons that you're talking about. I kind of find that from talking to younger mayors, they don't seem to have much interest in transitioning from being mayor to being in the national parliament, because they don't want to really go from being an executive with all sorts of control to being a backbencher. And so I do find that even the younger mayors, they're trying to hold on to the office sort of as long as they can. And it's not always clear sort of what their next step should be in their careers. For some, they do, if it's a smaller town or city, sometimes they run for national government. Sometimes they're kind of waiting to get enough terms to sort of run for a prefectural governor. But just related to your question about sort of time horizons, I found that they're sort of more likely to be expecting to sort of be in their current office for longer periods of time, as opposed to sort of thinking beyond the current office, thinking to sort of running for higher levels of government. But as to the term limits, yeah, I'm not sure. It would be interesting to study. One thing I really wanted to look at was, I don't have a huge time range in my data, but if we had more data or you looked at other data, I'd really like to look at, do preferences sort of get locked in based on the age that you become mayor? So if I become mayor at 45, maybe I become known as sort of a child welfare mayor, right? And so even when I'm 65, if I stay in office for 20 years, I've spent 20 years being the child welfare mayor, and so I'm actually behaving quite differently, right, than what mine would predict. Or does it change over time? But again, since I only have a sort of 15-year span, I don't have that many instances of those cases, but I would like to look at sort of, does it change? That's just the kind of thing I'd like to know to sort of better answer your question about term limits.
Thank you so much for your talk. My question also relates to mechanism. So I'm sure you know in 2020, Japan's environment minister, a young politician, took paternity leave, and which is extremely rare for working fathers in Japan. So the results you showed that younger mayors have more spending on child welfare. To what extent do you think that reflect liberalizing gender attitudes in different generations, politicians' approach in dealing with population aging?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I don't always emphasize it here, but one thing that's sort of interesting is, I'm focusing on sort of childcare versus elderly welfare spending from an age perspective. But of course, there's all sorts of wonderful work thinking about childcare from a gender perspective. But in my case, almost all the mayors are men, right? And it's sort of interesting that even male mayors in this case are increasing spending on family benefits. Could be in line with what you're saying, that the sort of liberalizing gender attitudes. I guess I don't have a great chart to show you, but anecdotally, again, from talking to mayors, I could say that, I do think that there might be differences in gender attitudes about whether the extent to which the government should be involved in providing publicly provided daycare, right? So I think that there's a traditional gender norm in Japan that mothers should stay at home, especially the ages between 0 to 3. And so part of it could be sort of a reluctance to invest because they don't, they're concerned about sort of they don't want public money on sort of public daycare centers because they think the mothers should be at home. They don't think, they're less concerned about sort of women working in the office. But I don't really have a clear way of testing it. But again, anecdotally, I've heard lots of younger mayors talk about, and there's one, I can think of one younger mayor who, Naomi Koshi in Otsu, who was she's a younger mayor, and she was also the first person to institute sort of mandatory parental leave for both men and women in her municipality. So again, anecdotally, I can think of instances where that definitely gels with what I would think, but I don't have a chart for it.
Okay, I was going to ask a couple of questions from the Zoom room,
Yes.
And encourage more people who are zooming in to and you can go and give the microphone to the next gentleman here, so he's ready with the next question. So two questions actually kind of go together nicely, so I want to put those together for you. So one of our graduate students here, Nguyen Nguyen Xiang, asks, I wonder to what extent the knowledge we get from Japan is transferable to understanding other democracies, since to some extent Japan's political system is very responsive to voters' preferences. In other words, are old politicians in other countries as unresponsive to young voters' preferences as in Japan? And related to that, Jordan Hamzawi asks, if the elderly participate at a greater rate and politicians respond to that, which is more or less what Nguyen Nguyen is saying is unusually true in Japan, isn't that democracy working?
Yeah, so let's see. Those are both really interesting questions. So one thing is that I found is that just in thinking about the extent to which these lessons might generalize to other countries, is that apart from these types of, Japan and the US being countries where, there aren't very many young people in office and they aren't spending money on family welfare, the sort of third part of this puzzle is that there's a clear correlation between how many young people are in government and the extent to which young people turn out to vote, right? So we sometimes talk about it as sort of like a vicious cycle. Young people are less interested in politics because they're not getting the types of policies that they want, so they don't turn out to vote, they don't run for office, and all of these sort of reinforce each other. So it's a slight aside from the question that was posed, but what I've thought about is this is definitely a case, we're talking about cases where young people are not getting the types of policies they want. They are not, able to they're not turning out to vote at high rates. Japan's an older country, and so I have wondered about, say, in Denmark, for example, right? It's not a younger population, but young people turn out to vote at much, much higher rates. 40% of the Denmark legislature is under 40 years old. And so I wonder there, and some studies have also suggested that these countries have smaller gaps in the preferences between younger and older people. I haven't looked at that myself, but I'm sort of taking on a side to the question, which is I'd like to see whether the results here translates to countries where young people either participate a lot more in elections or have greater descriptive representation. Or we could think about the third case, which are more developing countries, like say Brazil, which have really large youth populations, right? So I'm sorry, I'm not exactly answering that first question. And then Jordan's question about sort of, isn't this democracy working? I suppose that the outcomes are representing the interests of those people who turn out to vote. And we might wonder about sort of from a democracy perspective as well, why are young people not turning out to vote? What are the obstacles? What are these? And I think there's a sort of norm that we might have that we want to encourage everybody to turn out to vote at greater rates. So yeah, I'll just pause there for the.
I'm sure Denmark is the Borgen effect, right?
Yeah.
You have a cool TV show with a young prime minister, then you're going to get more youth voting, right? You should
Yeah.
start a similar program in Japan, see if
Yeah.
you get a similar effect. Okay, another question from the audience?
Thank you very much. Well, very, very interesting. So still, right, even though older people find young candidates more attractive, still older people vote for older candidates, correct?
I'm not sure about their actual voting behavior, but in experiments I've done, they're as likely or more likely than other groups to say they would vote for a younger candidate.
Oh, really?
So actually I found, I've done some experiments about sort of looking for whether there are age affinity effects, right? Like looking for whether you're more likely to support a candidate who's closer to you in age. And I find that those effects happen for younger people and sort of middle-aged people, but not for older people. So they actually are, it's interesting, they're quite supportive of voting for younger people. Again, at least in surveys.
Well, that's quite independent of policies they support. They propose.
Yeah,
maybe.
it's perhaps independent, but again, I'm not sure
You
because
don't
in this
know,
case,
right.
the younger mayors aren't really doing things detrimental to the older people's interests. I suppose we could talk about a sort of, zero-sum like kind of opportunity cost, right? They're not taking the money from the elderly. They could be focusing more on issues important to the elderly. But I think that there are some issues that the young people focus on that the elderly might also be interested in. And they're sort of, I don't know. They seem to I need to do more work on it to try to figure out why
I'm
there's
curious, in real world,
Yeah.
is there any evidence that younger people vote for younger candidates primarily because younger candidates are advocating for their own benefit, that is welfare for kids and things like those?
Yeah, I haven't been able to sort of get like the real, it's difficult to get real world, like how people voted sort of by age group or like by locality in Japan.
I see.
What I guess I can say is that I found that like in my data set, that younger candidates who do run actually do better than other age groups, holding other things constant. So younger candidates, holding constant party or the type of municipality, they get more votes overall. But I can't say sort of like if those votes are necessarily coming from the young or from the old. I'm trying to get at that question, but thus far I've sort of only looked at it from in the sort of survey experiment setting.
Yeah, I was wondering about this perspective effect, that is, right, younger candidates take longer term perspective,
Yeah.
whereas older candidates have shorter term. I wonder if that's because what they see as a perspective of their major constituency. That is, younger candidates believe that they may get more vote from younger folks who would likely to have a longer perspective because they have to live longer.
I guess I could also say that I have looked just within my data at sort of, I showed you based on the earlier question from Dan about just comparing sort of younger mayors versus younger voters. I've also looked at sort of the interaction effect, or seeing if younger mayors are only doing this in particularly young municipalities, and there doesn't seem to be a clear interaction effect. So actually younger mayors are kind of doing the same types of policy changes, not regardless, but there's not a clear significant interaction effect with the demographics of the constituency. So it doesn't exactly get at what you're talking about, but I've kind of thought about it as perhaps evidence, not ironclad evidence, but perhaps evidence that it's more about the sort of the intrinsic or personal preferences as opposed to electoral incentives.
Yeah, one more very quick question. So older candidates or mayors do not do particular favor to older people, right? That's one thing you said. But they are emphasizing short-term benefit regardless of age.
Right.
But in effect, that's really benefit older people because younger people have shorter-term interest and also longer-term interest, whereas older people tends to have no long-term interest.
Yeah,
So I thought that might be very nice way to conceal providing benefits to older people.
I see. This is not exactly what you're talking about, but it made me think of something, which is that one thing I have looked at is that in more rural areas, for example, it's more common for sort of both, for the parents to live, the grandparents to live with the parents and the children all together. And in those cases, I don't see as large effect. And one possible interpretation just from talking to people there and from talking to mayors there is that in those cases, I think the families really view these kind of welfare spending as much more sort of substitutes for one another. They don't really mind whether they're getting an elderly welfare subsidy or a child care subsidy because everyone's in the same house, they just want more money. But in this case, my effects are more focused on sort of medium-sized cities where you don't really have 3 generations necessarily living together. Now, again, these are just like heterogeneous effects. It's sort of in the direction of what you're talking about. It's a little bit of a different perspective, but that's sort of what I was thinking about when, cases where younger people might benefit from the elderly welfare subsidies, the direct payments, as much as the elderly.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Yeah. Oh.
Couple more questions from the audience before I go back to the Zoom.
Thank you for your presentation. I just wonder, when you're doing the interview, because you were saying this differences in age, but then the older politicians were once young. And did you ask the older politician about like whether there's differences in their policies when they were younger?
So it's tricky because a lot of times the older mayors are not lifelong politicians. So a lot of the older mayors were actually bureaucrats in the local municipalities, and then the mayor can sometimes be their first political position. It's not always the case. There's all sorts of different pathways, and I talked to all of them, but a lot of the ones I talked to, when I asked about sort of their younger age or like what they were doing when they were younger, they were involved in the welfare, but they weren't in a sort of like political position. But that's a good question. I don't have a great response to that sort of like, that's a very curious thing. I didn't think about asking them sort of like if they tended to focus more on these policies when they're younger, in part because I also was focused on this more recent phenomena of the sort of daycare shortages. But that's a good question.
Did you see any evidence that political party affiliation is a factor in the age of the candidates standing for election?
So in my case, when I was focused on these mayors, it's political parties are definitely involved in local politics in Japan, but it's a complicated process because most mayors run officially as independents, but they do get like some party support from the side. So like the poster of the mayor's face, for example, doesn't say Liberal Democratic Party. It will say like independent. And so for me, that was sort of a feature because I didn't want the sort of party pulling the strings. I wanted to focus more on the characteristics of the mayor. I have tried to look at party differences, but there's not that many people who have the sort of party support. The only thing I found, and so this is going to not be the most satisfactory answer to your question, is just that I don't find that it's the case that, say, the younger mayors are way more likely to have ties to the national party. So what I was concerned about was maybe the younger mayors have all sorts of party ties to the central government. They get into office, and the reason that they're increasing spending on child welfare is because they have all these LDP ties. They get more money from the central government, and then they spend it on child welfare. So I don't find that. So again, I'm sorry that there's not, unfortunately, a lot of variation in my data set about the sort of party. And then looking at other ones, I will look more about party differences. I've mostly been sort of like holding party constant in Japan to see if we still find age effects, but I'd really like to see sort of LDP differences in national politics versus opposition party differences. So thank you. I'll look more into it.
Thanks. Another question from me is, do you have any sort of thoughts or discussion about the generalizability of this local treatment effect? You talked about a little bit about heterogeneous treatment effect based on the pre-treatment covariates, but like outside of the cutoff, like around the areas, like the other regions of the forcing variable, do you have any idea about that?
Yeah, so are you talking about generalizability like really close to the cutoffs, or are you talking about sort of like outside of these close elections to other types of municipalities?
Outside of the close elections.
Yeah, so I wish I had a slide to like back it up, but I have looked at sort of more generally, can we see these even where there aren't close elections, using sort of, let's say like more of like a diff and diff type model, or like generalized, like just with municipality and year fixed effects and changes in time. And I can find differences. They're smaller. And again, they tend to be more in those sort of like 50,000 to 200,000 person size municipalities. So there's almost no young people running for office in sort of 10,000 or 5,000 person villages. So I don't really have any variation there. And there also aren't a lot of younger mayors. I mean, there's a younger mayor of Chiba, but there's not a lot of younger mayors of giant cities as well. So I can't tell if it's just because of like, that's the data I have. But where I have more data, I do find effects, but they are smaller. I think more akin to the sort of 8% or something, 6 to 8%, depending on the model. But I will try to add that because it's good to show that it's not just, one of the great things about the RDD is, trying to estimate this local average treatment effect, but the downside is that this is only estimated for really close elections. And there's all sorts of municipalities that don't have very close elections between younger and older candidates.
Great, thank you.
Sure.
Okay, so going back to the Zoom, and I'll just kind of situate this in within the broader concern about just the robustness of the results, and particularly that, a real challenge with this kind of research is choosing appropriate cutoffs, and how this is there. Of course, there's essentially a number of ways of doing so. And so, Ilun Shi, our graduate student in sociology here, was asking. He gave a couple examples. So, for instance, if you have an indicator with a 40-year-old cutoff, does that change if you use a 50-year-old cutoff? And he was wondering if graphs look different if we used median age among MPs in general rather than choosing a particular age as a cutoff point. So I think it would just be interesting to if you could tell us a little bit how you thought about this, and how you came. Every solution is going to be imperfect. There are going to be pros and cons to any approach, but if you could tell us a little bit about how you thought about these problems of cutoff and how to make it the most transparent, responsible way you could for the research.
Yeah, so I think there's a couple of different ways. I've thought a lot about how to adapt these like close selection RDDs for age, and there's other kinds of challenges to RDDs that I'd be happy to talk about as well, but specifically to the age cutoff. So my approach has always been trying to pick a cutoff to begin with that seemed to make intuitive sense, again, based on the institutional context in terms of what are the types of ages of candidates. I need enough observations also to be able to estimate an effect, and then what seems salient to social welfare. Start with cutoffs, and then just show how the results change if we do different cutoffs. So this is the spending on child welfare, and so I chose 50, before looking at the results. I basically find effects if I used a cutoff between like 42 and 52. Below 42, I just start running out of observations. It's very small. It's arguable whether there's even enough observations to be confident that you can estimate an effect. So this has been my approach. There is another way of approaching this, and I don't want to get too in the weeds, but you could, instead of using the cutoff approach, try to estimate the effect of an additional year of a mayor's age. And you don't have to go too much into it, but it's sort of it's called a fuzzy regression discontinuity design, and you try and estimate the effect of a single year. To me, some people have tried this actually. A different paper tried this in sort of the appendix by Alessina et al. To me, in my setting, it didn't make sense because given the distribution of mayors, they're almost all in the sort of 50s and 60s anyway, so I'm not really sure estimating the effect of a single year makes much sense. So from the beginning, I always went with a sort of cutoff approach. But I have definitely found that there is no cutoff that makes everybody happy. Your comment, Dan, I often get the cutoff question where somebody's very happy that they made the cutoff, or they're very unhappy in the audience they didn't make the cutoff. But again, I try to start with it, but I'm happy to show. In general, the findings for the younger mayors are more robust than the ones with the older mayors. So that short-term spending is a little bit less robust. It's sort of like 68 to 72, but if you go too far, it doesn't seem to have as much an effect. But the investment is very similar, where it's sort of like 42 to 52, I basically find effects. The largest effects seem to be around like 42, 43, which I have thought is sort of the nice sweet spot between having enough observations and being a little bit closer to sort of the younger side, but I'm not sure.
Well, mostly it's been a bad year to be 49 because I had to wait longer for the vaccine. So it's kind of a sort of a silver lining to know that I'm still, you know, young in political terms too. And actually, I would say, you know, one takeaway from all of this, you know, a silver lining of silver democracy is that we can all look forward. I mean, aging is a bummer, but as we get older, we could look forward to democracy actually working for us.
Yeah,
We could always say, well, maybe we'll eventually be represented, and so it's something to look forward to as we get older. But this is really really a terrific talk. It's great research. It's just really meticulous, but also, you know, super accessible, specific to Japan, but also speaks to these like really global issues. So, really a fantastic presentation. I want to thank Charles for giving this great presentation. I also want to thank Liz Malinkin for helping to navigate the technology, as well as Derek Groom, who is doing so from home. He's sick. He couldn't be here in person, but even from his sick bed, he's helping organize all of this. So thanks very much for that. One word of future programming here at WCED. We're going to have another in-person meeting next week. We're going to have another in our program in our Flashpoint session on the case of Nicaragua, where elections are coming up. So that's going to be a great in-person session next week. But without further ado, please join me in thanking Charles McClean for a terrific presentation, and look forward to seeing you here at future events, both here and on Zoom. Thank you.